Now that I am back at home in my home lab, I can finish filling out the sample event form, the metadata. So making sure that I'm putting the correct codes here, the date, the location, the decimal degrees of my sample and the time that I took the sample, and along with the environmental conditions, so air temperature, wind speed and direction. These are taken from the Met Office app. That's the one I choose to use. The cloud cover and the sea state are done by visual observation, and you're pre-provided with charts to be able to assign numbers to those. Also note down the high tide time and the height, sunrise time and moon phase, and if you have taken the salinity and the surface temperature, you can note those there. In the net and trawl details, most of these will already be noted in your files, but it is often helpful to note the depth, or the toe length, the amount of toes that you did, or the time in minutes, just because that allows us to have context for this particular surveying event. You can also make notes here as well. So for example, there were lots of people on the pier crabbing today, so I've just made a note of that. The first thing to do when you get your sample home from the survey point is to put it into petri dishes. Now, sometimes that might be one petri dish, it could be several petri dishes. And often, if there's a lot of sediment in your sample, you may want to leave it for a few moments to settle out so that you can then pour non-sedimenty sections of the sample in petri dishes and then have a final petri dish with all of the sludge in it to examine later. I'm going to give this a swirl just to pick up the sediment in the bottom. And I'm just going to use a pipette to get out the last tiny bits. So I now have 2 petri dishes with my sample in it. I'm going to look at one of them. I'm going to pop the other one in the fridge. I have my petri dish under the low-powered stereo microscope, and I'm going to have a look and get a feel of what the sample is like. Okay, so I can see lots of barnacle larvae. I can see a few copepods, some ostracods, and some polychaete larvae. When you're looking at your sample for the first time, make a note of the things that stand out to you. Is there a lot of one particular organism, for example? Is there a lot of that organism compared to maybe previous weeks? Is there something in there unusual that you don't see very often? Perhaps you can make notes of that as well. Now, if I'm doing a presence-absence survey, I can now tick off the organisms that I have seen under the microscope. So we saw some Cirripedia nauplii. There were lots of those, so I'm going to write a note that there were lots of those in the sample. We also saw some copepods. We saw ostracod, and we saw some polychaete larvae. I'm now going to keep looking at the sample. Also seen some copepod nauplii. That off, and a gastropod larva as well. Once you've noted down some of the more obvious organisms that are in your petri dish, you can start to check to make sure that you haven't missed any of the smaller organisms or less common organisms. So things such as diatoms or foraminifera, maybe sea squirt larvae are something that can quite easily be missed. So go over your petri dishes again and keep in mind looking for those organisms perhaps that you've not seen that are on the list, just to check that they are or are not there. Also, don't forget to look at the surface of the water as well as what's on the bottom of the petri dish. So move your focus knob up and down so that you make sure that you check the whole of the water column from the surface down to the bottom of the petri dish. Of course, I mustn't forget to take photographs of the organisms that I see for the verification stage. So I've attached my mobile phone to my microscope with quite a cheap adapter here. And I'm just going to take some photographs of the organisms that I see. It may be easier to use a pipette to take out individual organisms of each type, pop it in its own little petri dish to take a photograph of it so that you can get a clear picture and it isn't surrounded by lots of debris or other organisms. So I now have an ostracod in a smaller petri dish and I'm going to take a photograph of it. It's a lot easier to see it in amongst all of the other bits and pieces. Now it's in its own petri dish. If you have a higher powered microscope, you might choose to select some organisms or perhaps just a random sample from your petri dish. Pop them on a slide. So for the larger zooplankton, I suggest using a well slide or a concave slide. And for smaller organisms like phytoplankton, ciliates and foraminifera, you might want to use a flat slide. But you might want to take some samples from your petri dishes to pop under the higher powered microscope to look at in more detail for your interest or to help you identify what they are. Remember, if you are submitting those organisms as part of your survey, remember to take photographs of them under the higher powered microscope as well. Okay, so I have some of my sample on my well slide now, and I'm going to pop a cover slip on it because there's nothing in there that's too bulky that's at risk of getting squashed. Some things are so big that even in a well slide, you may have to leave a cover slip off because they're so big. I'm going to pop a cover slip on now and pop it under the larger microscope. So I've finished looking at my sample now and I've filled out my form, making sure that I've put the event ID in here. I've ticked off all of the organisms that I observed, make sure that I've taken photographs of them, and I've made necessary notes. For example, here I saw gastropod larvae, veliger larvae, and also eggs, so I've made a note of that there. And I also saw lots and lots of Cirripedia nauplii. I felt as though they were quite dominant, so I've made a note of that. Make sure you fill out both sides. If you have any notes, you might want to put them down here in this section as well. So once you have completed your survey and you filled in your forms, if you scan or photograph your forms and then email them to elizabeth@planktonproject.org.uk, I can get those verified. You'll also be needing to send me your photographs and we will provide you with a Google Drive folder that you can pop those into.